Okay, here we go.
When drawing pixel art or digital art of any kind, we're presented with millions of colors to choose from. It can be quite challenging to select a handful that work together for your project. A really great way to make your artwork more cohesive is to use a color palette.
Yeah, dude, I suck at this. I mean, I do it, but I have a really huge ass palette for my main project. It's much easier to keep a constrained palette in a very short term project. So like for like a jam game, it's very easy to stick to your palette. But for Familia, because I use assets from all over the place and it's just, I've done it over so many years, it's like really crazy to kind of stick to my palette.
Hopefully this video will help, and by the end we'll be able to select some nice colors. Welcome to my color tutorial. Let's get started.
It's a
Breaking
tutorial.
down the color settings. One of the best ways to select colors is HSB, or hue, saturation, and brightness. Hue is the actual color with nothing else applied to it. I like to think of it as a rainbow where you pick a color based on its name, like red, blue, or orange.
Side note, for those of you who use RPG Maker, the hue settings actually don't affect the mobile loading speed. I've actually found that through my personal experimentation. I read at a lot of sources that adjusting your hue in the RPG Maker engine doesn't really work well for like mobile devices. It's just not true. It's not been what I found. It's possibly because maybe the rendering engine got updated since this was a thing, but on Android I have no problem running. I get no slowdown from hues over times. Yeah.
Saturation is how intense or strong the color is, and you can visualize it as a scale from grey to full color. Finally, brightness refers to how light or dark your color is. So how do these settings relate to pixel art and game design? Well, cooler hues such as blue and purple can indicate calmness, green can indicate something natural, and the warmer tones can suggest more dramatic things.
Okay, this is definitely true, but there's always exceptions. These are like not even, I'd say there's an exception to every rule, but these are like not even rules. These are just kind of general guidelines.
Of
ideas.
course, this is an oversimplified approach to hue, and no specific hue to stick with the classifications listed.
I think when you're starting though, it's much easier to just think of it that way, and it's fine. It's like you don't want to overcomplicate it.
Saturation can indicate how fun or playful something is, with more saturated assets being used for cartoon, comical art styles, and less saturation for realistic, mature artworks. Brighter colors can be used for bright, happy things, and dark colors usually mean more dramatic, dangerous themes. In this sense, brightness is usually paired with saturation, but not always. Now we know what the color settings do, let's start picking some colors. Designing a palette.
Yeah, I would encourage people to, like, when they go around to different buildings, different businesses, like a bar, look at the walls, the color of the walls and the dramatic like lights versus like a hospital or a doctor's office or a church, and think about like how the palette is very intentional and it influences, you know, the way you feel and the way you think about the place. There's a reason why hospitals are generally white, except for maybe in like the child areas. And there's a very clear reason why, you know, like bars are black and pink. I don't know. Maybe that's just the bars I go to. Anyway, I digress.
The mistake a lot of people make when choosing shades for their colors is to only adjust the brightness. Just using the brightness can make the darker colors look dirty or muddy. To change this, we can saturate the colors as they decrease in brightness and desaturate them as they increase in brightness. But the most important change we can make is hue shifting. Hue shifting is changing the hue of the color as the brightness changes. Let's take this red palette for example.
Okay, I think those first two are pretty much a given across the board, and it's interesting how he says that's the most important. The hue changing as you change saturation is an interesting concept, and I think it makes sense for a lot of things, like maybe fire, for example, or certain types of lights, the sun. But in general, I would say for somebody who's starting off, I would say don't really worry about hue changes. Combining that with saturation, that's going to get most people confused. He's definitely talking about more of like a scene and the whole thing, like a composition together. But when you're thinking about like an individual character, you don't really have to, I think, I don't at least factor in the color as much. Anyway, he'll probably explain that as we go.
Highlights are more yellow and shadows are more blue, When hue shifting, we can apply the same idea. Going up from the red, we go through orange and into yellow. Going down from red, it starts to become more purple. By hue shifting, your selected colours will look more vibrant as they get darker, and in a game or scene, having all the shades colourful usually looks a lot nicer. So generally speaking, try to shift your lighter shades towards yellow and your darker shades towards blue.
Another thing I want to say that if you do what he's saying, it does look good, but you also have to be more constrained in your color palette to start. So if you're making a shadow shift into a red color, that will look great, but then you're going to have a smaller palette that you're working with from the start. Otherwise, it can get a bit muddy.
A few more examples. Your color palette could consist of a couple sets, one for each of the main colors you want to use. Now we have the color palette, we can refine it some more. We want to have as few unique colors as necessary to minimize double ups. A good way to retain cohesiveness and refine your color palette is to do something called color bridging. When you bridge colors, you make some of the colors on the highest and lowest ends of the spectrum the same, and this helps tie the sets together. Here's a drawing that uses a more beginner's palette, and here's a drawing with a few of the color rules applied. Okay, so we understand the basic rules and principles, but how can we use these to give our art a specific feel? Setting a mood. I think one.
Let's break down this photo a little bit more because he just kind of gives you an example, right? So as you can see, for the leaves, it's like basically it goes from a dark green into a light green. It's interesting in this sense because I don't see the contrast, for example. I know he's probably making this as an example, and I'm not sure if this is his art, but you can see the difference of having it do a yellow shift. It looks much more like sunlight. Now, if you were trying to get like an indoor lighted look, this would actually match more for a plant. This would seem almost out of place unless you're using like a very severely yellow light. But this much more looks like it's outside. The same can be said for the wood. There's a definite yellow tint on some of the highlights of this wood here. And it definitely makes it a lot more, it makes it feel a lot more like it's outdoors. Again, this looks like it's inside, like this tree looks inside. And if that's the look you're going for, like an indoor plant, yeah, sure, that's great. But definitely, yeah.
These to give our art a specific feel. Setting a mood. I think one of the biggest factors in setting a mood isn't the colors, but the lighting. Lighting can play a huge role in your scene and shouldn't be overlooked. Low, dim lighting can mean your scene feels scary and dangerous, like the character is fighting a boss or a villain.
Yeah, and dim lighting, especially when you have dramatic contrast. So if you have something really bright within something really dim, it comes off as more scary and dramatic. It's not as calming. So like this, to me, this background doesn't really seem like super scary, you know, just because it's pretty steady across the board. It has almost like a calm vibe to it. But if you were to put, for example, like some red eyes right here, it would make it look a lot more freaky.
If your scene is well lit, then it can have a more pleasant feel. Take these two drawings. One is dark, one is bright. Even when
Okay, so this is cheating. He has these little creatures with the eyes, right? Of course that's going to look scarier. There's like little goblins in the bushes. Although in general, I do agree that the darker color palette does look a bit spookier, and it's pretty much the same thing. But I really don't know if it would have as dramatic of a spookiness factor if there wasn't like these eyes in the middle of the bushes. So that's definitely a factor. But yeah, for sure, the daylight is always going to seem less scary than the nighttime. We're kind of wired that way as human beings to be a little bit more afraid of what we can't see.
changing the content, we've made a huge difference with lighting. Another thing to keep in mind when setting a mood is temperature. Naturally, warmer colors can feel more inviting, and cooler colors less. This is because we associate color with temperature. In these two...
I feel this, and a quick side story. I feel like when I used to work on the road when I was like my late teens, like when I was 19, I was a traffic controller, and I'd be out there for like 8 hours at a time. I really felt like I felt cooler when I put on my sunglasses, and it really wouldn't actually cool me, but I think because the colors were cooler that I'd see, it made me feel like I was cooler. This is like a real thing. And there are colors that can make you feel warmer psychologically. So there are glasses that actually make you feel like you're in like more of a warm environment or a cool environment or whatever. And that's just kind of like something to know. But it definitely translates over to art as much as it does to real life.
The left one looks much more inviting just through the use of warmer shades. online resources. When going about a drawing or a game, I think it's important to finalize your color scheme and mood beforehand.
Yeah, definitely. Get your color scheme together before you start. Decide what colors you're going to use. Another thing I would tell people is if you're using pixel art, make sure you have an idea of your resolution before you get started, because that'll inform everything. That'll inform your UI. Don't just start making art and go crazy. Figure out how big your tiles are going to be and figure out how many tiles by how many tiles the game will be, and have that all kind of set up. And then you can deviate from that a little bit. Like, it's not a huge deal if you add a color or two throughout the production of a 1-year project, right? But it is something you want to have set up, before you get started. You don't want to go in blind and not have a color palette set up. Especially for jam games, because it'll just make you go a lot faster, because it takes a lot of time to move backwards and like rearrange your color palette retroactively, which is something I've done. And it's one of those things that takes a ton of time. You want to have everything kind of worked out, and then you just kind of fill in the blanks, versus like going back and having all this stuff you can't use, or having stuff that you can use, but it's going to take a long time to alter. So finalize your color palette scheme beforehand, and your resolution too.
There are a couple of free websites that can be quite useful for making color palettes. The first is coolers.co, a free website for generating and finding color palettes. By hitting spacebar on the Generate tab, Coolers will generate a unique color palette. It won't take long for you to find a color palette you like, and when you do, you can export, save, or edit it. On the Explore tab, you can discover some of the best palettes made by other people. The next is lowspec.com, a pixel art centered website with hundreds of pixel-oriented palettes to choose from. If you're not comfortable making your own palette just yet, I highly recommend this site. Both are linked in the description. Thanks for watching this video. I really hope you could find something useful.
And just to tag on to that, like, it makes a lot of sense to use, like, one thing I see a lot is a lot of people are trying to reproduce the standard Super Nintendo or the original NES or even the N64 color palette. And those palettes can be Googled pretty easily, and you can find them and just use the hex code or the RGB numbers that coincide with that palette. So if you want to produce a game that really feels like a SNES and really pushes that nostalgia button hard, like Ten's game is a Cowboy really does that with SNES. You can look for those specific palettes, and also you can use those palettes as a reference if you're trying to create that same feel. The way Pixel Overlord is doing it, that's kind of more of a way I would approach like a corporate branding package or something. And it works for video games too, don't get me wrong. But it's going to give you something that won't necessarily emulate that old retro game style. It'll create something much more new, which I think is great. But if you're trying to emulate something from the SNES era, the Super Nintendo era, the Super Famicom era, then just go grab those palettes. I made a game for a game jam that was a platformer, and I used the Sega Master System palette, which is the Sega equivalent to the original NES. And it had its own vibe and its own feel, and I liked it. And it did feel like a Sega Master System game when you played it. Our resolution was a bit higher, so it's kind of disjointed. But for the most part, it still had a similar vibe. And if you were around and you had a Sega Master System, which was not really the most popular console, then you would still kind of be able to connect it. And I thought it was fun, and I just wanted to try and use it and get it to work. And it works, For having like a constrained palette, I feel like sometimes people feel like it's really hard. Because I don't do it often, I feel like it's really actually a lot easier. But a lot of people feel like it's really hard. So it just depends on your approach. Like, because for me, I tend to like the constraint of a very specific palette. It just tends to make decisions easier when you're doing your pixel art. But there are like things you can't do. So it's kind of one of those things where the grass is always greener on the other side. But I don't know. I think for the most part, this is a great